I see what ho, chaps and chavets, Game Chap and Bertie here.
Yes.
Yes, indeed, fellows. I dare say we are now discussing here the lost stage in Super Smash Bros. My goodness, this is quite an interesting subject, old chap.
It most certainly is, yes indeed. A lost stage somewhere out there in the world of the Super Smash Bros. Series.
That's right. Now, this particular stage comes from the rather popular entry in the series, Super Smash Bros. Melee on GameCube.
It most certainly does, yes indeed. And as you quite rightly say, a lost stage, if you like. A stage that never appeared, yet was somewhere in the background.
That's right. Now, the particular stage we are talking about here, fellows, does in fact exist in the game files of this game on the GameCube. So basically, it is indeed a stage that actually exists within the code, but for some reason, it never made it into the final game. And also, if you try to use a certain debug method to try and load the stage or force the stage to load, the whole game actually crashes.
It does indeed, you're exactly right. Apparently, you can actually try to access this stage, as it were, using an old device called the Action Replay. Remember the Action Replay?
Oh, the Action Replay. Yes, that's right.
You can get into debug mode, but if you do, the darn thing crashes.
That's right. Now, what exactly is this stage, fellows? Well, the name of the stage is Arcanea. Some of you may recognise that as a place from Fire Emblem. And of course, there is rampant speculation that perhaps the stage Arcanea did indeed refer to Fire Emblem at one point.
Yes, indeed. Of course, Fire Emblem at the point we're talking about here in the Smash Bros. World series hadn't actually appeared for a stage anyway.
That's right. Of course, in the days of Super Smash Bros. On the GameCube, we actually had Marth and Roy coming into the Smash Bros. Series for the very first time. These were two characters who were relatively unknown at the time, actually, and Nintendo decided to bring them into Super Smash Bros. Perhaps partly because they were interesting swordsman characters, but also to promote the game Fire Emblem in the Western region. And of course, after that, we saw that Fire Emblem indeed became quite popular over here as a result, or at least partly as a result.
And most certainly, yes indeed. Now, we mentioned earlier you can't access it, and apparently the game, as you say, crashes if you attempt to start a battle on this particular stage. Yes indeed.
That's right. Now, the error, it says, is actually quite interesting because it says ground.c colon 204, all that sort of technical code stuff, not found stage param. Okay, so in other words, what they're saying here is this particular file exists. You can actually select Arcanea in the list, but when you actually go to load it, of course, the models for the stage, etc. and so forth aren't there. And there is no known way to force this stage to load. In other Smash Bros. Games, there are unplayable stages, which of course you can force to load using certain Action Replay codes, but you can't force this one to load, which is why it is the lost stage of the series, if you will.
Indeed, it's lost there, but you can't sort of get at it. Now the thing is, I mean, let's look at the history of this, because people must be wondering, well, what's all about this? I mean, do we have more information on this stage?
Yes, indeed.
Official information, I mean.
Well, it seems to me as if Mr. Sakurai himself has actually spoken out on this stage quite a while ago, in fact.
Ah, has he indeed? Now, what did he say?
Well, you see, fellows, it seems indeed that, as you know, of course, there's not actually a Fire Emblem stage in Super Smash Bros. On GameCube, and I do believe Mr. Sakurai actually said that apparently, something along the lines of the following, at least, it was going to feature a castle at which boulders would apparently be launched, perhaps in a sort of a besieging type environment. Also, apparently, dragons and mages, units from the Fire Emblem game, would also be appearing on the stage.
Exactly, so they had a rather good plan for this stage.
Right.
And in fact, they had planned for it to appear, I believe, as well.
Indeed, of course.
But of course, it never actually came about.
Perhaps that's where you'd fight Roy, etc. and so forth, and I do believe actually you fought Roy on the temple stage when unlocking him, so something quite interesting there. But if this stage had made it into the final game, perhaps you'd have been able to fight him then and there.
Very possibly, yes indeed. And now, did they say anything else about this stage?
Well, also, quite an interesting point here, Fidels.
Yes.
The track Fire Emblem from the game Super Smash Bros. On GameCube is in fact called, in the internal game reference to that track, Arcanea.hps. Okay, Now that of course references the same stage name. Perhaps the Arcanea.hps music file would have initially played on this stage had it come to fruition back in the day.
Perhaps it could have been, yes indeed. So Arcanea, a stage hidden within Melee, still there today.
That's right.
Can't access it, but they had planned for it to come out. Doesn't it make you wonder what other stages there may be that were planned to come out and never came out?
Well, indeed, of course, we can't see the initial drawing board, as it were, for Super Smash Bros. On any of the consoles, in fact, but but we can say that this particular stage was indeed planned but never saw the light of day. However, interestingly, it did indeed come to light, of course, at a later point in the Smash Bros. Series in the form of the stage Castle Siege in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. We saw something quite interestingly similar there, where we had, flaming boulders being hurled at a castle before it transitioned down to the main throne room and then to the underworld beneath.
Aha! So they brought it back in aftermath. They brought it in Brawl.
That's right, and of course it's appeared again in Smash Bros. On Wii U and 3DS.
Ah, yes, but the thing is, though, why did it not appear? Why did they get rid of it? Why didn't they bring it in?
Well, I mean, I don't know. Perhaps, this is just a theory, old boy, but perhaps it was scrapped at the time because of, I don't know, but maybe time constraints. Perhaps they had to get this game to market. They started making the Ocarina stage, but in the end they just didn't have the time or perhaps the inspiration or the resources to finish it before the release date.
Well, it could be, yes. I mean, they say that, the circumstances surrounding it, as it were, they're just unknown. They're unannounced,
unspecified, I suppose.
Unspecified, yes.
Right, that's quite interesting. I mean, perhaps at the time also, bear in mind this was 2001 or before then, when the game was under development. Perhaps in those days they didn't necessarily have the necessary technical power on the GameCube to make this stage a reality without dragging the game down to a crawl in terms of frame rate, or perhaps it just wasn't even possible on that hardware.
Well, it could be indeed, yes, of course. So we've got the hidden stage there, or not really hidden. It's secret. It's just never come to surface, as it were. But the things I wonder, I mean, are there characters and things like that, perhaps?
Indeed.
In Melee that never came about.
I believe there are a number of characters within the Smash Bros. Series, of course, that are also considered lost, and perhaps that'll be the subject of another interesting video. As for this one, we can certainly say that Arcanea was hidden, and indeed is hidden in that game right now. It's just sort of lurking underneath the surface there. It is there, but you just can't access it. So, in all intents and purposes, it is in fact a lost stage. There is, of course, the other stages, Dummy and Test in Super Smash Bros. Melee. Both of those can also be accessed with the right codes. One is a very long stage, which sort of shows a bar in the background. The other one is a completely black stage with a single platform on it. Again, quite mysterious, but I think those two were perhaps used initially for testing purposes by the dev team, and they weren't intended to make it into the final game, unlike this one.
Right, okay. So with this stage, we know that you can't do it because it crashes, but I mean, this game is quite a few years old now, lots of different technology and things. I mean, do we know, has anyone tried to actually get into it since there and just hack into it, other than using the old
action replay? That's quite an interesting question, actually, because I understand very recently, in fact, within the last year, someone did come up with a code and a way to play the original Final Destination stage in the Smash Bros. On the N64. Now, of course, if you tried to access that using that game's debug menu, again, that crashed, and for a very long time, people just couldn't play on that stage because it was impossible. The game just said, nope, not having any of it. But of course, nowadays, you can actually use this fairly new action replay code as a workaround to play on that stage. Now, I mean, I think the Arcanea stage, if it does indeed exist somewhere in the game files, it's probably in ruins, old boy, probably just bits and pieces floating around in space, old chap.
Yes, indeed, I suppose it would be, yes.
There might be perhaps a few polygons, bits and bobs here and there. I mean, if we were ever going to see this stage in Super Smash Bros. Melee, I think perhaps it's possible, but perhaps a lot of reconstruction and, shall we say, inspired thinking would be necessary on the part of the fans to perhaps build this stage up using what we already have of it in the game files. But by no means is it impossible, old chap.
Yes, indeed. Now, maybe someone will come out with that, but,
perhaps.
Lots of hidden things.
Yes, this is very interesting, of course, this kind of thing, because it does hint at what we might see in the future for Super Smash Bros. I mean, if you ask me, one thing I've been saying for a very long time, old chap, of course, is why didn't we have Princess Peach's castle and Bowser's castle in Smash Bros? And also, will we one day see another castle-based Fire Emblem stage, perhaps a bit like Arcanea was originally going to be?
Well, we don't know. I mean, I think Nintendo are a lot more careful nowadays with sort of leaving things, hidden in the code that they never use. Because, of course, people,
they are.
Very much more nowadays. People tend to dip into the code, have a look, see what's going on, see if they can find anything.
That's right,
whereas they didn't used to do that so much years ago.
Not so much in those days. And of course, these days, if you look in Super Smash Bros. Brawl and 4, you won't find a debug mode in either of those. It sadly has been removed, so we can't have a dig around like we can in those older games.
No, indeed, of course.
So there are, fellows, a rather interesting insight into the lost stage of the Lost Kingdom of Arcanea.
You can just see the there's sort of vines hanging from it, can't you? The Lost King.
Yes, it exists
Age.
somewhere, you know, but there's a dusty old sort of spawn point with, sort of tumbleweeds blowing across the screen. It's all covered in dirt and you know, there's vines growing all over this old castle. The boulders are just lumps of stone now in the ground. They're fossilised.
I did the vines thing. You don't need to go over the top.
I
did that.
You get the idea.
Yes. Oh, yes, yes.
But maybe one day I'll
And you fall down a big hole.
Yes,
and then
right.
suddenly you come into the world.
Yes,
it's a world of digital things and signs and all sort of words.
That's enough creative writing for one day, thank you, buddy. So anyway, perhaps one day our brave Smash Brothers fighters may be able to battle at last on this lost stage, but for now it remains just that, for Fails, a lost stage. This hasn't even been game chap and Bertie. Thank you most kindly for joining us, I say. And we look forward to seeing you once more on the next exciting investigative outing, old chap. Indeed, I say. Until then...